The sky above Earth did not tear open like a wound. It unfolded like a judgment, layers of reality peeling back with the patience of something that had all the time in the universe to be cruel. One moment the atmosphere was blue and familiar, cluttered with satellites and the lazy arcs of commercial flights, and the next it was crowded with shadows so vast they bent perspective itself, shapes that looked less like ships and more like moving cities dragged out of a nightmare carved in steel and prayer. Their hulls were Gothic mountains, armored in belief as much as adamantium, cathedral spires rising from their backs, stained glass windows depicting victories that had been won before Earth had learned to name its own continents. They arrived without haste, because haste implied urgency and urgency implied doubt. These vessels carried neither. In every nation, alarms sounded too late to matter, screens flooded with sensor data that made engineers quietly excuse themselves from their stations to vomit in corners, because nothing in their equations allowed for objects that large to exist, let alone maneuver with deliberate grace. On the flagship, a bridge the size of a stadium hummed with sacred machinery and the muffled screams of servitors hardwired into systems that no longer trusted human hands. Lord Solar Marius Valen stood at the center of it all, a monument to a philosophy forged in extinction events. His armor was ancient, its surface etched with litanies of obedience so dense they looked like texture rather than text. His face bore no anger as he studied the planet rotating beneath them, only assessment, the way a man might evaluate a fortress already scheduled for demolition. Earth, he had been told, was human. Human worlds were supposed to feel familiar. This one did not. Auspex readings flickered, reporting energy signatures that spiked and vanished, power outputs inconsistent with any Imperial war engine, yet localized, mobile, personal. Valen did not frown. Anomalies were simply problems that had not yet been categorized for execution. Broadcast compliance protocols, he ordered, his voice calm enough to make the threat implicit rather than spoken. The message rolled across the planet in every language humanity had ever used to beg, barter, or pray, a single demand wrapped in the vocabulary of salvation. Submit, be counted, be corrected, be useful. On Earth, people stared upward, their myths colliding with something older and far less forgiving. In Metropolis, Clark Kent stood very still as the words reached him, not through speakers, but through the subtle shift in the air that told him history had just taken a hard turn. He listened, not as Superman, but as someone who had spent his life believing that understanding was always possible if you tried hard enough. The message did not ask to be understood. It informed. It categorized. It condemned in advance. Clark closed his eyes for half a second, and when he opened them, there was no panic there, only resolve tempered by something heavier. Responsibility. He rose into the air slowly, deliberately, making sure every camera that could track him did so, not as a challenge but as a signal. He was here. He would speak. On the flagship, targeting runes flared as a single figure climbed toward the fleet, unarmored, unshielded, moving under his own power through vacuum and disbelief. Tactical officers spoke in clipped bursts, their words layered with static and disbelief. No propulsion. No warp signature. Mass readings inconsistent. Lord Solar Valen watched the approach with interest that bordered on curiosity. This was new. New things were dangerous. They demanded correction. Hold fire, he said, surprising several officers who had already begun the rituals required to ask their guns for permission to kill. Let it come closer. Superman stopped just outside the ship's void shields, hands visible, posture open, cape drifting like a flag of intent rather than conquest. His voice carried across frequencies with practiced gentleness. He introduced himself not as a weapon, not as a god, but as a protector, and in doing so committed the first and greatest heresy in the eyes of the Imperium. He framed power as service rather than entitlement. Valen listened, really listened, and found himself unsettled not by the words, but by the absence of fear beneath them. This being was not bargaining. He was offering. Doctrine demanded an answer. Doctrine always did. You exist outside authorized human parameters, Valen replied, his tone almost respectful. Your presence constitutes an uncontrolled variable. Compliance requires removal or assimilation. Superman shook his head, slowly, as though the motion itself were an apology. We don't do that here, he said. We talk first. We find another way. The pause that followed was brief, but in that briefness entire philosophies collided. To Valen, mercy was a resource, finite and rationed by necessity. To Superman it was the foundation. The order to fire came not with rage, but with regret so deeply buried it might as well have been ritual. Lances of light speared outward, calibrated to erase cities, converging on one man who did not dodge so much as reposition, bending physics just enough to remind the universe that rules were sometimes suggestions. The beams missed. The silence afterward was louder than the weapons. Superman remained where he was, unharmed, his expression unchanged except for a tightening around the eyes that suggested disappointment rather than pain. He had hoped, foolishly, that words would be enough. On the bridge, Lord Solar Valen felt something he had not felt in decades. Uncertainty. Not fear. Not doubt in the Emperor. But the faint, treacherous realization that doctrine might not be sufficient against a being who treated restraint as strength and power as obligation. Escalate, he said quietly, because escalation was the Imperium's native language, and anything that spoke a different one had to be taught, even if the lesson burned worlds to ash. Far below, Earth watched its champion hold position against an armada designed to break civilizations. And for the first time in its long history, the Imperium of Man faced a truth it had never needed to consider. Some wars were not decided by who could destroy more, but by who could endure the cost of not doing so. The first shells did not fall toward Earth. They fell toward Superman, and that distinction mattered more than any tactical map could show, because it revealed intent stripped of pretense. The macro cannons spoke with the sound of ancient thunder given metal throats, projectiles the size of transport vehicles accelerating with enough force to rewrite local gravity as they tore through the upper atmosphere. Each shell was a prayer wrapped in mass, inscribed with blessings that declared destruction a sacred act. Superman moved, not away from Earth, but around it, positioning himself so that every trajectory intersected with him before it could descend further, his body becoming a living intercept vector. He did not strike the shells with anger or defiance. He caught them, redirected them, shattered them against each other in bursts of fire that blossomed harmlessly in the stratosphere like artificial suns dying before birth. On the bridge of the flagship, tactical displays lit up with failure reports cascading faster than officers could acknowledge them, probabilities collapsing into statistical impossibilities. Lord Solar Valen watched without speaking as the impossible repeated itself, not once, but systematically, the mark of intention rather than luck. This was not a fluke. This was doctrine of a different kind. He is prioritizing planetary defense over offensive action, a tech priest intoned, mechadendrites twitching as logic engines strained. Casualty minimization appears to be a governing parameter. Valen's jaw tightened. Casualties were an acceptable cost. They always had been. A being that rejected that premise was not merely powerful, it was destabilizing. Below, the sky over Metropolis burned with reflected light as people fled streets not yet targeted, running on instinct older than language. Superman heard them all, heartbeats stacking into a cacophony of fear that pressed against his mind like a physical weight. He could end this quickly, he knew that now with terrible clarity. A single decisive strike, a demonstration of force that would cripple command structures and force retreat. The math was clean. The consequences were not. He absorbed another blast, felt the energy flood his cells, power begging to be released, and forced it down because power without control was exactly what he was trying to stop. The next escalation came not from orbit, but from the ground, because the Imperium understood symbolism even if it misunderstood mercy. Drop pods screamed through the atmosphere like falling verdicts, punching into the industrial outskirts of the city with enough force to fracture concrete and certainty alike. Space Marines emerged in disciplined silence, giants in crimson and steel, weapons raised not in haste but in absolute confidence. They advanced as one, firing controlled bursts that turned streets into kill zones measured in meters and milliseconds. Superman descended into their midst like a living ceasefire, hands raised, voice amplified just enough to cut through gunfire. "Stop," he said, and the word carried no threat, only pleading weight. The bolter round struck him and fell away, detonations blooming uselessly against skin that refused to yield. The Marines recalibrated instantly, switching weapons, tactics evolving in real time, because they were not monsters, not brutes, but professionals bred for adaptation. Meltaguns fired, bathing the air in stellar heat that would have reduced tanks to slag. Superman stepped through it, cape disintegrating, expression unchanged except for a flash of something like sorrow. He did not strike back. He disarmed, disabled, restrained, every movement calculated to end violence without ending lives. A power fist swung. He caught it and twisted just enough to lock the joint. A chain blade screamed. He pinned it between fingers that would not bleed. To the Marines, this was incomprehensible. Mercy was not a tactic they had been trained to counter. It did not fit into threat matrices. It could not be suppressed with firepower. Above, the watchtower came alive as sensors flared. Alarms cascading through a structure built to observe, not intervene. Batman stood at the center of it all, silent, calculating, already mapping contingencies faster than human thought should allow. "He's holding back," Green Lantern said, awe and unease mixing in his voice. "On purpose." "That's the problem," Batman replied. "If he stops holding back, this becomes something else." Wonder Woman did not wait for permission. She launched from orbit, spear of will and myth cutting through atmosphere, landing beside Superman with the force of a controlled earthquake. Her presence changed the equation instantly. Where Superman embodied restraint, she embodied resolve, blade still sheathed, shield raised not to attack but to stand. "You are not gods," she called to the advancing Marines, voice carrying the authority of centuries of war. "And this world is not yours to claim." More League signatures followed. Green Lantern's constructs flared into being, emerald geometry knitting itself into barriers that absorbed fire meant to kill. The Flash appeared and vanished in heartbeats, evacuating civilians faster than panic could process, rewriting outcomes one person at a time. Hawkgirl took to the air, wings cutting through smoke, mace humming with restrained violence she did not yet unleash. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The Imperium moved as hierarchy, every action routed through command, every soldier an extension of doctrine. The League moved as trust, fluid, adaptive, each member acting independently yet in perfect coordination. On the flagship, Valen watched the feeds and felt something shift beneath the armor of belief. These defenders did not fight like rebels or insurgents. They fought like custodians. "They are not attempting to defeat us," Commander Hark observed, incredulity bleeding into his tone. "They are attempting to contain us." The realization landed heavier than any defeat. To be contained was to be framed as the problem. Valen's fingers tightened around the armrest of his throne. Escalation beckoned, its logic clean and brutal, cyclonic solutions to ideological inconveniences. Yet every escalation so far had been answered not with equal force, but with deliberate refusal to cross certain lines. Superman hovered above the battlefield, armor scorched, eyes tracking every threat, every life, and for a moment their gazes met across impossible distance. A man of doctrine and a man of hope locked in silent assessment. Valen saw it then, the thing that unsettled him more than invulnerability or coordination. Choice. This being chose restraint even when victory was assured. It was not weakness. It was discipline of a kind the Imperium had never cultivated, because it had never believed it could afford to. Cease ground engagement, Valen ordered slowly, every syllable weighed against millennia of precedent. The words rippled outward, Marines pulling back with mechanical obedience, weapons lowering but never fully disengaging. The battlefield quieted, smoke drifting over a city that still stood, against all expectation. Superman exhaled, a breath he had not realized he was holding, and the League regrouped around him, battered but unbroken. This was not victory. It was something more fragile and far more dangerous. Proof. Proof that annihilation was not the only answer. Proof that doctrine could be challenged without being destroyed. And proof, most unsettling of all, that the Imperium's greatest enemy here was not power, but the possibility that another way might exist. Silence, Lord Solar Marius Valen had learned, was never the absence of action but the space in which the most consequential decisions were made, and the bridge of the flagship was steeped in it now, broken only by the distant hum of reactors and the muted chanting of machine spirits being placated by tech priests who sensed their master's hesitation like a fault line opening beneath sacred ground. The tactical hololith still displayed the city below, scarred but standing, its defenders regrouping not in triumph but in vigilance, as if they understood that the most dangerous moment had not yet arrived. Valen's gaze lingered on the blue and red figure at the center of it all, hovering amid allies who deferred to him without question, without visible hierarchy, a leader whose authority was not enforced but assumed through trust. That alone would have marked him as anomalous. But it was not leadership that troubled Valen most. It was restraint. In 70 years of war, Valen had never once seen restraint survive first contact with escalation. It was always burned away, replaced by necessity. Yet here it was, intact, persistent, almost defiant. Reassess threat parameters, Valen ordered, his voice steady despite the heresy of the request. The tech priests complied, Benharic cants spilling from Vox grills as calculations updated, models reran, probabilities shifted. The result did not change. The defenders of Earth, led by the entity designated Superman, exceeded all known baselines. Not through raw power alone, but through coordination, adaptability, and an apparent refusal to accept losses as acceptable variables. Lord Solar, the inquisitorial observer said at last, stepping forward, mirrored mask reflecting Valen's own armored silhouette back at him, this situation meets the criteria for existential deviation. Humanity here has evolved beyond acceptable doctrinal boundaries. Their tolerance for abhuman and xenos integration is absolute. Their champions operate outside imperial authority. Left uncorrected, this world represents a philosophical contagion. Valen knew what came next. He had issued the order before, spoken the words that turned planets into footnotes. Cyclonic torpedoes slept in their sanctified cradles, world-ending solutions wrapped in prayer and protocol, waiting for justification that was already forming in the mouths of his advisors. Authorize exterminatus, Commander Hark said quietly, reverently. The threat is not the planet. It is the precedent. Valen closed his eyes just for a moment, and in that moment he did something dangerously close to remembering. He remembered worlds that had begged. Worlds that had complied too slowly. Worlds where children had stared at the sky much like Earth's children were staring now. He remembered telling himself that survival required hardness, that mercy was a debt humanity could not afford. And he remembered believing it completely. Below, Superman felt the shift before any weapon fired. He felt it in the way the air seemed to hold its breath, in the tightening of probability around the fleet's formation, in the subtle but unmistakable sense that the next decision would not be reversible. He turned to his team, met each of their eyes in turn, and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would make what came next easier. Batman's voice came through the calm, low, urgent. "They're considering a planet kill option. I can't stop it from here." Superman nodded once. He had known this was possible. He had hoped, foolishly, that proof would be enough. The sky above the fleet darkened as launch bays irised open, revealing the cylindrical silhouettes of weapons designed not for war but for erasure. Cyclonic torpedoes did not threaten. They concluded. "This is it," Green Lantern said, construct flickering with strain. "If those launch, we won't have time to evacuate." Superman rose, higher than before, climbing until the blue of the sky bled into black, until the curve of the earth filled his peripheral vision, fragile and singular. He opened a channel not as a plea but as a statement of fact. "Lord Solar Valen," he said, voice carrying across the void with calm that had been forged in the acceptance of impossible responsibility, "if you launch those weapons, I will stop them. I will do whatever it takes." On the bridge, Valen watched the feeds as the lone figure positioned himself directly between the fleet and the planet, a living shield against annihilation. The audacity of it would have been laughable in any other context. Here it was terrifying. "You cannot stop inevitability," Valen replied, even as doubt crept uninvited into the edges of his certainty. "You mistake destruction for resolution," Superman answered. "You've survived by burning everything that challenged you. That doesn't make you strong. It makes you afraid to imagine another way." The word struck deeper than any weapon. Valen's hand hovered over the final authorization rune, the one that would seal Earth's fate and reaffirm everything he had ever believed. He thought of the Imperium, vast and brutal and enduring, held together by doctrine because doctrine was simpler than trust. He thought of this world, chaotic, defiant, defended by beings who could have conquered it and chose instead to protect it. "Lord Solar," the inquisitorial observer pressed, "hesitation is deviation." Valen lowered his hand. The bridge froze, officers staring in disbelief as centuries of precedent balanced on the edge of a single decision. "No," Valen said, and the word echoed louder than any cannon. "Hesitation is evaluation." He turned, fully now, to face the image of Superman hovering against the void, power contained by will alone. "You claim to value every life," Valen continued. "You claim restraint as virtue. Prove it." Superman did not hesitate. "Name the test," he said. Valen exhaled, a sound lost in armor but heavy with consequence. "Stand down," he ordered to both fleets and gods. "If your restraint fails, if even one of my ships is destroyed by your hand, this world burns. If it does not, then we talk." The launch bay sealed. The torpedoes remained dormant. Across the planet, no one cheered because no one understood how close annihilation had come. Superman hovered, motionless, feeling the weight of billions of lives settle fully onto his shoulders, heavier than any mountain he had ever lifted. He had stopped the end of the world not with force, but with a promise, and promises were fragile things in a universe that preferred certainty. The war had been paused, not ended, balanced now on the most dangerous weapon of all. Trust, extended between enemies who had never learned how to hold it. The battlefield shifted without anyone moving, violence receding not because it had been defeated but because it had been deferred, and in that narrow, dangerous space between annihilation and agreement, words became weapons heavier than any cyclonic warhead. The fleet held position in high orbit, guns powered but silent, a predator choosing to watch rather than strike, while on the ground a neutral zone was carved out by absence alone, an open stretch of land far from population centers where consequences could be contained if control failed. Superman descended first, boots touching soil with deliberate gentleness, as though reminding himself and the universe that this world was still alive, still worth arguing over. Wonder Woman landed beside him, armor gleaming but blade sheathed, her presence a reminder that diplomacy without strength was begging, and strength without restraint was tyranny. Across from them, a thunder of controlled force announced the Imperium's arrival as a lander settled, engines scorching Earth into glass. Lord Solar Marius Valen emerged in full armor, flanked by honor guards whose weapons remained lowered by command alone, not trust, the inquisitorial observer moving like a shadow that had learned how to walk. They stopped at a precise distance, close enough for conversation, far enough to signal readiness. For a long moment no one spoke, the silence stretching thin as wire, every second a test of resolve. Valen broke it, not with accusation, but with a question sharpened by experience. "You claim to defend humanity," he said, Vox amplifying his voice into something ritualistic. "Yet you refuse the structures that have allowed humanity to survive a hostile galaxy. Explain why your way does not end in extinction." Superman did not answer immediately. He looked past Valen, past the soldiers, at the sky where the fleet waited like a judgment that had learned patience, and then back at the man inside the armor. "Because survival without choice isn't living," he said. "You've protected humanity by deciding for it. We protect it by trusting it." A ripple moved through the Imperial delegation, subtle but real, discomfort passing like static through disciplined ranks. The inquisitorial observer leaned forward. "Trust is a vulnerability," she said. "Every catastrophe in our history began with misplaced faith. And every one you caused," Superman replied calmly, "began with deciding that fear was wisdom." The words were not an attack. They were an invitation to examine scars rather than glorify them. Valen felt it, the pull of an argument that did not deny the Imperium's suffering, but questioned its conclusions. "You speak as though you have faced nothing like what we face," Valen said. "As though your world exists outside the cycle of predation." Wonder Woman stepped forward then, voice carrying the authority of someone who had watched civilizations rise and fall long before either empire existed. "We have faced gods who devour worlds, monsters born of hatred, wars that reshaped history," she said. "And each time, we learned that becoming what we fight is the fastest way to lose what we're trying to save." Valen studied her, ancient instincts recognizing a warrior who understood cost. "And when mercy fails?" he asked. "When your enemies do not share your restraint?" Superman answered, and his voice carried the weight of every battle he had ever regretted. "Then we fight. But we fight to stop, not to erase." The distinction hung in the air, fragile and radical. Valen turned away for a moment, gazing across the farmland, at a world that had not been hardened by endless war, and for the first time he allowed himself to imagine it surviving without becoming something unrecognizable. The Imperium had always assumed that unity required domination, that order required obedience enforced at gunpoint. This world proposed a different equation, one that relied on individuals choosing to stand together rather than being forced into alignment. It was inefficient. It was messy. It was dangerous. It was also, Valen realized with a quiet shock, alive. "If we leave you unclaimed," he said slowly, "you become a variable beyond our control. Others will find you. Worse things than us." "We know," Superman replied. "That's why we stand ready. Not as subjects. As partners." The word landed like a heresy and a revelation in equal measure. Partnership implied equality. It implied trust in something other than hierarchy. The inquisitorial observer shifted, calculations spinning behind her mask. Such an arrangement would require oversight, she said. Observation. Safeguards. Batman's voice cut in over the channel, cool and precise. You can watch. You don't get to rule. Valen almost smiled, a gesture lost inside armor but felt nonetheless. He had spent his life enforcing absolutes. Now he stood at the edge of a compromise that would be recorded, dissected, possibly condemned. This world will not join the Imperium, Valen said, each word weighed like a verdict overturned. Not today. Not by force. The tension spiked, then fractured, Imperial officers stiffening as doctrine bent without breaking. But understand this, Valen continued, turning back to Superman. You will be watched. Tested. The moment your restraint becomes weakness, the moment your trust collapses under the weight of reality, we will return. And we will not ask again. Superman nodded, not in submission but in acknowledgement of reality. That's fair, he said. And when you're ready to imagine a galaxy where survival doesn't require burning everything you don't understand, we'll still be here. The silence that followed was different from the one that had preceded annihilation. It was not tense. It was thoughtful. Valen gave a single, sharp nod, a gesture that would be interpreted 1,000 different ways by 1,000 different observers, and turned back toward his lander. As it lifted, the fleet above began to reposition, not retreating but loosening its grip on the sky, the wound in reality slowly knitting closed behind it. On the ground, the Justice League stood together, watching an empire reconsider itself, however slightly. It was not victory. It was not peace. It was something rarer and more dangerous. A pause in a universe that rarely stopped to think. Superman felt the weight ease just a fraction. Enough to breathe, enough to hope, and in that moment he understood that the hardest battles were not fought with fists or fire, but with the courage to believe that even monsters of history could choose not to be monsters forever. The fleet did not leave in triumph or disgrace. It withdrew with deliberation, engines burning not in retreat but in recalibration, as though an ancient machine had encountered data it could not immediately categorize and had chosen, for once, not to override it with fire. From the ground, the sky healed slowly, the last fractures in reality sealing like scars that would fade but never fully disappear, reminders that the universe had brushed close enough to leave fingerprints. Superman watched until the final shadow thinned into distance, listening to the city breathe again, the collective exhale of millions who did not know how narrowly they had escaped becoming history's ash. Around him, the Justice League stood in quiet formation, exhaustion settling into bones and minds alike. Not the fatigue of battle but the deeper weariness of having held the line where certainty would have been easier. Batman broke the silence first, voice low, analytical even now. They'll be back, he said. It was not a warning, just an assessment. Superman nodded. Yes, he replied. But not today. That mattered more than it sounded like it should have. In orbit, Lord Solar Marius Valen remained at the viewport long after protocol demanded he stand down, watching a world that refused to fit neatly into the Imperium's ledgers. Reports scrolled past him, dissenting opinions logged, justifications prepared for inquisitorial review that would slice his decisions into fragments of legality and heresy. He accepted that. He had accepted worse. What unsettled him was not the scrutiny to come, but the quiet realization that annihilation had not been the only way forward, and that knowledge, once acquired, could not be purged as easily as a rebellious planet. He convened his commanders, not to plan conquest but containment, observation, a posture that acknowledged limits without admitting weakness. This world is designated autonomous under provisional non-hostility, he declared, and the words would ripple outward, debated, resisted, and ultimately recorded as precedent, dangerous and necessary. On Earth, governments scrambled to reassert relevance, to explain what could not be explained, to reassure populations that had glimpsed their smallness and their worth in the same breath. Superman did not attend the briefings. He stood instead in Smallville, boots sinking into familiar soil, the quiet of home wrapping around him like armor no forge could replicate. The farmhouse stood unchanged, stubbornly ordinary against a universe that had just expanded violently. He closed his eyes and let the sound settle. Wind through corn, distant engines, life continuing not because it had been permitted to, but because it chose to. Wonder Woman joined him, gaze thoughtful. "You didn't win," she said gently. "No," Superman agreed. "I didn't." She smiled, faint and fierce. "Good. Winning like that changes people." He considered that, thinking of Valen, of an empire built on the belief that change was a luxury it could not afford. "So does losing," he said. This was something else. Across the stars, the Imperium would argue about Earth for decades, about the implications of a human world defended by beings who rejected submission yet offered cooperation, about the risk of allowing an idea to exist that suggested unity could be chosen rather than enforced. Some would call Valen a visionary. Others would call him a traitor who had blinked. Valen himself would sleep poorly, haunted not by the worlds he had burned, but by the one he had not, by the memory of a man who could have shattered his fleet and chose instead to speak. That memory would trouble him more than any rebellion, because it introduced a question doctrine was not designed to answer. What if survival did not require cruelty as its foundation? Back on Earth, Superman returned to Metropolis, to a city patched and bruised but alive, to people who waved not because he had saved them with strength alone, but because he had stood between them and oblivion without asking for obedience in return. He addressed the world not as a commander, not as a god, but as a neighbor who had seen something terrible and chosen to believe something better anyway. "We are not alone," he said, and did not soften the truth. "And the universe is not kind. But we are still who we decide to be. That hasn't changed." The words were simple, insufficient to capture the scale of what had occurred, and precisely right. In the watchtower, sensors returned to baseline, alerts downgraded, contingency plans archived but not forgotten. Batman logged a final note in a file that would never be closed. Imperium of Man, status, deferred. Risk ongoing. Variable, hope. It was not a variable he trusted, but it was one he had learned not to dismiss. Time passed as it always did, indifferent to victories and near apocalypses alike. Crops grew where landers had scorched earth, scars fading into stories, then into lessons. Somewhere far beyond human sight, imperial augurs would continue to watch, to calculate, to wait for proof that restraint would fail. And somewhere on Earth, a man who could lift mountains would continue to help old ladies cross streets, to stop fires, to listen, because power expressed only at its maximum was a failure of imagination. The war that had been promised did not come. Not yet. In its place stood an uneasy understanding, a line drawn not in blood but in intent, fragile and unprecedented. The universe remained vast and hostile, filled with empires that measured worth in obedience and survival in conquest. Earth remained small and defiant, defended by those who believed that even in a cosmos built on extinction, there was room for choice. And in the quiet moments between crises, Superman would look up at a sky that had nearly fallen and remember that the greatest victory of that day had not been stopping weapons or fleets, but proving that hope, when held with discipline and restraint, could force even the oldest doctrines to hesitate, and that hesitation, however brief, was where tomorrow found space to exist.